Is this, I'm sure you've been asked this question a million times, is this about rand strength or dollar weakness?
Absolutely. This one I can answer simply. It's about dollar weakness. If I can put it to you in another way, if we have a look at the rand versus a number of currencies, so we lump them together in a basket, in fact the rand is no stronger now versus that basket of currencies than it was at the beginning of September. So despite the fact that we've strengthened apparently against the dollar, looking at it on a trade-weighted basis, in other words, looking at the rand versus the basket of currencies, we're no stronger than we were at sort of good 6 weeks ago. And so I think that makes the point.
But then why is everyone getting so tense about the dollar in particular?
Well, you know, it's important because it's the central reserve currency of the world. So a lot of things get priced in dollars. Your commodities are priced in dollars. Food often gets priced in dollars. Oil gets priced in dollars. A lot of the imports that we bring into the country are priced in dollars. And so it naturally becomes something that we focus on. But it's a good point that you raise, because it's also probably a good time to point out that the US probably only makes up, if this much, 20% of the global trade that South Africa does. In fact, it's probably a bit less than that. So the fixation with the dollar perhaps is something that we need to address as in terms of the media, in terms of how we put the message across to people. But it's not just about the dollar. In fact, South Africa does trade with a number of other countries, and that's just as important.
Now, that's an interesting point you raised, because I never realized that. If we are only technically spending 20% of our imports in dollars, what is our biggest import? I mean, what are we spending most on? Is it pounds or euros or
well, the biggest thing that we import is in fact oil, and that's priced in dollars. Okay, so that's important to distinguish. When we talk about that trade weighted, or that weighting in the trade weighted basket, we're talking about the whole of South Africa's trade, and what portion of that we trade in and amongst the US. Yes.
Oh, okay.
But we may trade more in terms of the dollar because a lot of things are priced in dollars.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that as a country you are directly affected by that trade with the US.
Got your point. Now, is there, because everyone is, there are a whole host of things. They're saying cut interest rates. I'm reading all over the place here. Tax incoming funds, tax outgoing profit, cut exchange control. The MPC meeting is coming up next Wednesday. Yeah. Is there anything we can do? Or is this just way bigger than us? And we've just got to sit back and ride the wave and just hope the wave's going in the right direction?
A couple of things there. The first thing is that I think the point needs to be made that South Africa needs to look beyond the currency for its competitiveness. So South Africa as a country needs to take a long, hard look at itself and see what ways we can bring into the industrial policy of this country. In other words, make business more effective, more efficient, before we look at the currency. So there's no point in looking at a currency when you as a country are not productive enough. So that's the first thing that I would say. In terms of your question whether or not this is just way too big for the policymakers to handle, you get some insight into that by listening to what Director General of the Treasury, Lesetja Kganyago, said recently. Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan said it. Jill Marcus, Reserve Bank Governors, also pointed to the fact that there are some huge structural features to the global economy that are impacting on the currency market at the moment.
Well, what is a structural feature? A
structural feature is something that is at the very core of a broader movement in the global economy. So if I paint a picture for you, at the moment you've got some policies that are being implemented in the likes of the US, in the likes of the UK and Europe, which are of such a nature that they are, by their very nature, are currency depreciative. Now, what I mean by that is that they effectively are debasing their currencies. They are almost destroying the value of their currency.
Why would they want to do that?
Well, it's not a case of that they want to do it so much as they are trying to implement these policies to save themselves from another economic downturn. So they're trying to save themselves from an economic downturn by following these policies, but the policies themselves are wealth destructive. The offset of that, or the unintended consequence of that, is that countries such as South Africa, and indeed many other emerging markets, that don't need to follow such policies and that are following more prudent economic policies, are suddenly viewed as countries that are attracting these huge hordes of capital that inadvertently, because they didn't mean to do it in the first place, but that it's happening by default because of what's going on abroad. So effectively what I'm saying is that there's this huge movement that's happening abroad over which local policymakers have no control over whatsoever, and we are effectively asking our local policymakers to fight what's going on overseas.
Okay, wait, no. I think I get your point. So these guys, some of the countries overseas are implementing policies that are wiping out their economy and their wealth. So those guys who have money to invest are investing it in emerging markets like South Africa.
Correct.
And that's why we're getting this inflow of currency.
Correct. If I can use an analogy of two pots. Okay. If I've got one pot, which is the South African pot, where money is more or less static, the amount of money in the economy is more or less static, then I have a look at a US pot, where we know that the Federal Reserve, their central bank, is effectively printing money and is just about to embark on another round of printing money. What happens is that pot effectively becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So you've got a proportionately higher amount of dollars that needs to be exchanged for a relatively fixed pot of rands. Mm-hmm. By very definition, if you've got more dollars and proportionately fewer rands, because the rand's not growing, the amount of rands not growing by the same amount of dollars, the exchange rate has to account for that, and that gets reflected in a rand strengthening. Now, what you're effectively asking the local policymakers to do is to fight the Federal Reserve's printing of money abroad.
Which they can't do.
Which they can't do, because quite honestly, let's look at the numbers, and the numbers are that in the course of the past 2 years, the US Federal Reserve has printed in the region of $2 trillion. In fact, no, sorry, it's not quite that much. It's about $1.5 trillion.
Ah, give or take half a trillion.
Give or take half a trillion. So when you're talking $1.5 trillion and you've got a South African Reserve Bank, which on a good month will buy maybe $1 or $2 billion to build their reserves, you get a picture of the huge disparity in quantum between what's going on abroad and what local authorities feel is prudent to do.
I just get scared when I hear things like this, because it just makes me sit back and think that somewhere in Harare, Robert Mugabe is sitting there saying, "You see, I told them, you have got to print money like we were doing in Zimbabwe. We did the right thing. We were ahead of our time."
Yeah.
Hey, that to me gets a little bit scary. It takes the first world straight into the third world.
Yeah, probably the biggest distinction between the two, and you're not far wrong. I mean, that's effectively what Zimbabwe did. The big difference between a Zimbabwe and the US is that Zimbabwe went and attacked its very productive core. So they went from being a productive economy to being a very unproductive economy, whereas the likes of the US, the UK, and Europe are still massively productive economies.
Let's come back to this productivity thing, because you were saying earlier that in South Africa we need to add value, as it were, to things that we're doing. And one of the main things is productivity.
Yes.
How do we get that going? Because you look at the recent Public Servants Association strike and those sort of things, there just doesn't seem to be that level of productivity that you have in South Korea.
Yes. Or Germany or China. Absolutely. And I think that's an important point to cover, because ultimately I think in creating the value you start to resolve a lot of South Africa's problems. So you'd ask, how would you go about doing that? Well, it starts at such a junior level, if you like, when you look at school kids. You want school kids to get the best possible education. With education, not only do they become more skilled and more employable, but they also learn about different social aspects of their life, such as HIV/AIDS, promiscuity, and how that can lead to bad health down the line. So you can start at a very young age with children and gradually build them up through solid foundations. Once you have those solid foundations, you move on to the next level, and that would be higher education. That higher education doesn't necessarily have to be a university. It can be somebody teaching somebody
Becoming
else
a plumber.
a trade. A plumber, exactly. Apprenticeships, for example. So we need a lot of those skills.
So
we don't have them.
This is a whole generation of work that we have to do.
For sure. And it goes further than that, because you get the generation of work in terms of building the core right, and then you've got to start tackling issues of your industrial policies. And what I mean by that is the very regulations and the policies that business has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So here we're talking about potentially labor regulations. We're talking about how easy or difficult is it to start up a company? Should companies be given a tax break to start off? Should we be encouraging entrepreneurship through learnership programs and the likes? So more of that to try and get business up and running, get the entrepreneurial spirit of this country, which I think we've got in abundance, but we just don't ever tap into. Get that sorted out. And then you can take it beyond that. You can take it a step further, where you start bringing in big developed companies to play their part. But it's so multifaceted, Jeremy. It starts right from a very young age all the way through to the developed companies, all needing to pull together. And ultimately, it's government and the policies that they implement, the regulation, perhaps too much regulation that they've got in some places, too little regulation in others, that tie the whole thing together.
I called you in to talk about the Rand. We've gone on a rambling rage about everything else, and I'm already exhausted. We're only halfway through the show.